Welcome to the Gentleman's Guide to Gaming, and part 2 of our recap of the Final Bout RPG, a Curseborne campaign that I'm currently running for one of my Patreon groups. As always, if you are interested in playing any games I'm running, you can check out patreon.com/MatthewDawkins. Alternatively, if you want to request a video, by all means, check that Patreon out, send me a little bit of cash, or head on over to MatthewDawkins.com and do the same there. There is a link to do so. And in the end, the easiest way, the best way to request a video, as lots of you have been requesting them in the comments, but I do have to give priority to those who pay, is pick up a copy of The World Below, which you can do via Backakit, or they came from the RPG Anthology. Get a hard copy of either and contact me via MatthewDawkins.com to let me know and request a video of your choice. So, I have been running Curseborne. I've got 2 campaigns on the go for my Patreon groups, and this one is Final Bout. You might remember from our last recap what happened was our characters, our crew, had attended a boxing match between Antonio Bellegard, a washed-up old boxer, formerly with a brain bleed, and an influencer by the name of Mazmark, who may or may not be a Logan Paul analogue. Bellegard, to the shock of everyone, severely crumpled the head of Mazmark in the ring. And while that was going on, our accursed, of course, witnessed various strange phenomena about the place. Our outcast, Simon McDaniel, heard a voice that was whispering, goading. Our dead, Gene Tavers, saw the ring open up into a kind of sphincter-like thing that was sucking up the blood in the mat. Recognized cat's eyes in the ring posts. It was all very weird. Now, with the fight over and Antonio Bellegard in his dressing room crumbling into ash after uttering a rather cryptic phrase, half of our crew are still at the theatre. The other half are pursuing an older, frailer-looking Antonio Bellegard onto the subway. We'll start with the subway, which is where Evelyn, our Gaki, our Hungry of the Gaki family, followed this older, frail, mumbling Antonio Bellegard onto the subway, hoping just to see what he was up to. He was clearly not quite with it and turning increasingly grey, and all of a sudden he threw up a great gobbet of bloody ash that splattered on the feet of the young women who were sat opposite, who recognised him as Antonio Bellegard, the person who just knocked out their influencer hero, Mazmark. This caused something of a scene in the subway carriage, because there were lots of Mazmark fans there. A young man, clearly on his uppers, very pale, pinprick eyes, started laying his boots into the rapidly diminishing Antonio Bellegard until Evelyn got into the young man's head with a dire command spell, issued the order, sit down and bother those young women over there, which he proceeded to do. This is where we introduced our newest character, because another player joined the group for our second session with his character, the rather ominously named Lucian Hex. I do love a character with an ooh sound in their name. He is a sound engineer, a bit of a rocker, hence the name, and friends with our other player character, Zayden, who is in the band Celestial Spear. And he intended to make it to the boxing match, but work kept stopping him from leaving the studio, and by the time he got on the train, the match was over because it only lasted about 2 rounds, so he was still on the train when Evelyn and Antonio Bellegard got on. He was in the carriage, saw all of this happen, came over to Evelyn, and they resolved that they would get Bellegard out of the carriage when the train next stopped. Well, it did stop, and as it did, the various passengers on board the carriage just started looking down and started getting distracted, just stopped talking. Everyone was seemingly someplace else. The only people who maintained their full consciousness were Evelyn and Lucian, who recognised that the stop they had arrived at, the River Walk, is a liminality, a liminal space, a station that typically regular mortals do not step off at. They don't recognize it, they don't notice they are there, and typically when a mortal does disembark at River Walk, they end up trapped in a labyrinth of corridors, staircases, tunnels, and may even get lost forever. The accursed are not so blighted there. This liminality is a known one to the accursed of Junction City, and so Evelyn and Lucian decided they would abscond with the fetal-positioned Bellegarde. They carried him off the train, and the train left, abandoning them on the platform. Now, going back to our crew at the theatre, well, they were rummaging through the ash remains of this Bellegarde simulacrum. And I should note as well that the Bellegarde on the train also spat up a coin into Evelyn's lap that she now has. Very odd. But yes, Bellegarde at the theatre. He had been disintegrated, as we know. Jean decided to take it upon himself to basically leave his cadaver in the remains of this Bellegarde and examine the theatre again, trying to find out whether he could discover anything about that eldritch entity that had infested the boxing ring. Well, through some lucky rolls, so even though a ring attendant had come out to scrub down all the blood, Jean was able to see that the various porous sphincters that existed on the ring were now all sealing up. It was like dough being pushed back together again, all the blood having been removed. But Jean communed with this spirit and found himself addressing one of these cat's eyes in one of the ring posts. It referred to itself as Ixit Lil Shockatil, an outsider that feeds on blood and violence and panic. And Jean successfully interrogated this alien creature that said that it is a scavenger, more or less. It goes wherever the violence is going to be. It has a good foresight for these kinds of things. And it is slowly building up power to the point that one day it will rise and consume everything in Junction City. Hundreds, maybe thousands of mortals. It is developing quite an appetite. Jean tried to get a read just from looking into this thing's eyes, how far along this process it was, or if it was just bluff. Well, Jean worked out that while it was not imminent, it was neither just starting. So it seems that Lil Shockatil's intent is true, at which point it departed. Meanwhile, Simon McDaniel, our outcast from the Keepers of the Broken Vine, decided he wanted to get out of the dressing room, get some fresh air, where Forrester, Gene Taber's camera operator, offered him a hit on a blunt, at which point Masmark's agent came storming up to him, addressing him as if he was the bodyguard for Antonio Bellegarde, because Simon McDaniel, our outcast, is a pretty large figure, and basically said, this was not part of the contract. It was supposed to be a friendly bout. It was a pre-arranged match with a pre-arranged result, like a wrestling fixture, not a boxing match. And now my client almost certainly has brain damage, as he has been whisked off to hospital. He may even die. Our client is worth tens of millions of dollars, maybe $100 million. How much is Antonio Bellegarde worth? Well, Simon McDaniel wouldn't allow the agent into the dressing room, which was probably just as well, given that Antonio Bellegarde wasn't wearing his best face in there. He was a lot of crumbled ash and remains. Instead, Simon intimidated him, scared him off, something horrific, indeed, inflicting the unlucky status effects on him, as he managed to achieve a wicked success on his role, and so he crashed into a framed poster, glass in his hair, frame wrapped around him. He staggered down the corridor and ended up taking off into full flight, tearing away. Zayden, in the dressing room, was taking photos of these remains and sending them to Lucian, who, based on some tech that he had purchased from an outcast of one of the Battleground Angels, was able to function in one of these liminalities. And so he was able to see the remains of Bellegarde in the dressing room, while, of course, another Bellegarde, was at his feet. Very, very odd. Zayden was, in the meantime, trying to compose a song that could encompass all of these events, and the player, to her credit, did a very good job of doing so. Wrote a fantastic little song, which I will see if I can find the... I'm not going to sing it to you because, I don't know the melody of this thing. But we will get the Ring of Shadows, and it doesn't go like Johnny Cash. I'll do the chorus for you. In the ring of shadows where blood is the price, bound by fear we roll the dice, fangs and fists in the devil's gaze, lost in the fever of the ring ablaze. This is a full song with a bridge, with verses, guitar solo. The player really went to a great effort there. This earned an experience point. It's fair to earn an XP, I think, when you compose lyrics for your musician characters' songs. Anyhow, Jean returned to his body and started rummaging through the remains of Bellegarde and found some odd substances in there. Bits of hair, some ligament, some brick dust, it looked like. Rolled a very successful investigation roll and identified this brick dust as being from properties in the oldest quarter of Junction City. The newer builds are basically of a grey material. This is old red brick dust, so he kept that in mind. But it looked to him like this simulacrum was not made of flesh. It was a construct. This was the simulacrum that had fought in the boxing match, while the frail version was just waiting outside the theatre. We return to the subway, where Antonio Bellegarde is undergoing some manner of convulsions. He is clearly on his way out. As Lucien tries to aid him, his skin starts sloughing off like bloody ash. He tries to get as much information out of Bellegarde as possible. What happened? How did you end up this way? Bellegarde is muttering and screaming, curses, of course. And well, then his jaw falls off. Lucien, God love him, tried to put Bellegarde out of his misery. He's never killed someone before in either premeditated or hot-blooded situations. Our unburdened sorcerer has a Swiss Army knife, tried to stab him. Got a cruel failure in the attempt. And so, stab 1 hits the sternum, breaks off the bone. Stab 2 pierces a lung. Stab 3 just misses the heart entirely, by which point Lucien Hex has fallen back and doesn't know what he's doing, and just creating increased suffering for the poor bastard who is disintegrating before him and Evelyn. Evelyn, well, she lets it happen. And then she summons his ghost. You see, the Gaki can summon phantasms, especially if it's in an area where someone has recently died. And in this case, well, Antonio Bellegarde was back, kind of, not among the living, but among the undead. And in order to bring him out of this place so he wasn't confined to haunting and liminality, she extracted the skull from the skin and the scalp, the hair around it, and put it in her handbag, in her purse, and carried it off with her. So now she is being haunted by Antonio Bellegarde, with the intent that they will hopefully interrogate him later. The crew ultimately convened on the street, where they exchanged the information they had thus far obtained. They decided they would head back to Evelyn's apartment. She has an unusually secure headquarters above a kebab store, Beelzebub's. And while it is nothing to write home about, she doesn't have a mansion, unlike a lot of Hungary, it is, as the name implies, unusually secure. It's one of the edges in the game. And so everyone took their seats, and Jean Tavers volunteered to perform a séance, speak to the spirit of Antonio Bellegarde, who, at this point, was going through the usual phantasmal traumas of not really remembering much. You see, phantasms are very basic ghosts. They don't have the same depth of memory and motive as the dead do. They get caught in loops that are typically tied to their manner of death. And so he kept looking at Lucien and addressing him and saying, "You're the kid who stabbed me repeatedly, aren't you?" And only making Lucien feel worse every single time it was mentioned. Clearly didn't recall much, but Jean, our dead of the poltergeists, after binding Antonio Bellegarde's spirit to one of those mannequin heads that some ladies have to put a wig on, so Antonio Bellegarde was trapped within, so he could address the entire crew through a solid object, like the creepy doll spell. Bled a cursed die to do this. Then the interrogation started. They asked all kinds of questions. They wanted to know what happened. How did this happen? How are you attached to Ixit Lil Shockatil? And he told a story. He said that Ixit Lil Shockatil's been hanging around his neck for quite some time, ever since he really started drawing blood, because after the brain bleed, when he was retired from boxing, he was little more than a drooling vegetable. He was confined to hospital until a very friendly lady came along and essentially said, I can make you lucky. I can make your wishes come true. I can make you walk again. Just take this lucky coin. And so he did. And within the next few days, he was walking. I mean, he had Ixit Lil Shockatil with him from that point, and he was prone toward aggressive tendencies, it must be said. He was still using a walker to move around, but he was heading out to roadhouses and bars and getting in fights without much intent to do so. And whenever he threw a punch, it was like a rocket, sending people to the hospital rather than just giving them a nasty bruise. He had an unholy strength about him. And so he sought out this woman. He tried to find her again, and he was wandering all over Junction City trying to find out who was it that gave him this gift. Eventually, after many weeks, many months of trying to locate her, he was drawn into a Goodwill store, on the front window of which was painted the words, "Your wishes can come true." Well, there was the woman, her face sculpted like a crescent moon, a long pointed chin and a protruding forehead. She looked like something out of a fairy tale. And she was glad to see him. She said, "You made it. You're better. You're walking just like I said you would be. Now, how would you like to do something for me?" And Antonio Bellegarde, of course, offered his services, and she said, "I want you to kill someone." He said, "No way, I'm not killing someone. I'm not a killer. I'm an athlete. I'm not killing anyone for you." And he walked out, but he felt this rage just growing inside him. Ixit Lil Shockatil, married to him, dragged around, feeding on all the violence, fomenting it. And so he went back, and he said, "What is it you need?" And she said, "I can make you famous, I can make you a star, I can make you the young hero that you were when you were in your prime. I could make a new you. All you need to do is agree to kill someone for me." Well, whether Antonio Bellegarde took that deal intentionally or not, certainly it would appear that a new version of him was created, because as we know, there was a strong simulacrum that was willing to fight Masmark while the frail version was waiting outside the theatre. But something went wrong. As he was saying when he was disintegrating, that he broke the contract, he broke the curse. Does this mean he didn't kill who he was supposed to? Simon, our outcast, was having all kinds of thoughts at this point. Maybe he was supposed to have killed Masmark in the ring, and because Simon saved his life while he was there bleeding out, if you recall, Simon, our medic, had dashed into the ring to administer some emergency first aid. Maybe that's what caused this disintegration. Indeed, now apparently the curse has been passed on to Jean Towers based on what the simulacrum said before it disintegrated. Well, Evelyn felt like Antonio Bellegarde, if he was kept around from this point on, would be a pest, what with his rather short-term memory, and so she decided she would feed on him, and getting a straw, thrust it into the head of the mannequin and sucked him up like a Capri Sun. Antonio Bellegarde was no more, and our Hungry had gained a curse die. But this left our crew curious. Who could have created a curse, a pact, that could create such a complete simulacrum, something so strong? What alchemy? And so 3 of the characters so far have spoken to some of their contacts in various forms. As an example, Zayden has spoken to his cousin, Kellen, also of the Sphinx family. And Kellen agreed, he was aware that in some of their territories there has been someone going around beating the living hell out of drunks and bums and bikers, anyone who happens to stop there. So whatever Antonio Bellegarde was saying seems to have the ring of truth to it. Meanwhile, We also had, of course, Simon McDaniel went to his a military hospital. There's a lot of the a lot of the Keepers of the Broken Vine. I think I've been calling them League of the Hidden Crossroads. Keepers of the Broken Vine that work out of this military hospital, and met up with Gunnery Sergeant Harry Lopez, one of his friends, a former serviceman like himself. Explained the situation. Explained about Ixit Lil Shockatil, this potential rift opening to the battleground that's opened up in the theatre, and Harry agreed if this rift stays there, then this theatre's going to end up haunted, that all kinds of accidents are going to happen, people will keep dying whenever blood is shed there, etc., etc. So Lopez said he will look into that for him. Meanwhile, beyond that, we had Lucian Hex, who got in touch with his rather paranoid mentor, a bit of a doomsday prepper by the name of Theo, who demanded that Lucian be speaking on a secure line before explaining, yes, this is some pretty impressive sorcery. And based on the appearance of this woman, based on her motives, Theo didn't suspect that she was just a mundane, if that can be such a thing, sorcerer and accursed. Theo suspects this is something that has bled through from an outside and is steadily manipulating reality to her whim. Theo is going to look into it, speak to other sorcerers in the city, find out what she can. And so that is where our session ended. That's where our session ended. Lots of dialogue in this session, a fair amount of roleplay, a whole song got composed, and people disintegrated. What more can you ask for in an RPG? Thank you very much for watching. If you do enjoy these recaps, do comment below. Of course, I appreciate it. And I will see you next time.